What's going on, guys? Welcome to another episode. Today's an exciting one. You want to know why? See the Z? See how it's sitting now? Well, it's going to be sitting a little bit lower after today. So the Z right now is sitting on stock suspension, and I've got aftermarket wheels and tires on it. The fitment on its own isn't that bad. I wouldn't really want to change too much of it. I want to maybe lower the front a little bit, but that's pretty much it. So I've got to say the fitment on this thing isn't that bad. You can see that the front end could probably be lowered, maybe a ½ inch, an inch at most, but for the rear, it's not bad at all. Now the main reason why I'm installing coilovers on the Z is actually to change up how the car feels instead of how it looks. The way that it looks right now is sweet. It looks pretty good for stock struts and shocks. So what we're going to be doing today is we're going to be replacing the struts and shocks up front and in the back with new fully adjustable coilovers. If you're one of my boys and you're subscribed, you guys would know that I used to have a 240. My 240 SX was on stock struts, and I swapped those out for upgraded coilovers. And I actually purchased the same brand coilovers because I was so impressed with how those things were. However, because I knew that they were good, I wanted to also do a little bit of an upgrade. So instead of just buying the standard coils, I purchased Swift springs in addition to them. So I purchased a full set of adjustable Fortunato coilovers, and they're inside this box, and I'm going to be taking these things out to show you how sick these things are. I already opened up the box and I am quite impressed with the quality and how these things look. If these things ride half as good as how they look, I'm gonna be quite impressed with this setup. So a setup like this is going to be going for pure performance. I'm going to be trying to get as much traction as possible, and I'll be able to utilize these fully adjustable coilovers to do exactly that. Now, if I was going for stance, I'd be going for a super stiff spring setup so that you don't have a lot of suspension travel, so you can get that wheel super close to that fender and get that perfect flush look. Now, that's not my thing. Stance isn't exactly something that I'm looking for. I want a perfect track stance, where it's going to be fully functional. If it looks great, that's awesome, but I'm leaning more towards performance over form. So if we dig deeper into this box, you'll see that these coilovers are custom made. So these are made for my setup. These were handmade, hand-built and everything. Now, not only are these handmade, but you can actually modify these afterwards. So these are what are called modular coilovers. I can get these coilovers sent back out to Fortunato, and they can install remote reservoirs for extra oil or any other kind of modification that I think would be good for my setup. So that's something that's really cool about these kind of coils. Now inside this bag, you're gonna have all the information as to when it's built, warranty information, specs, who built it. You've got your spanner wrenches, and you've also got a sticker. So let's put all this aside, and we'll crack open the real box and see what's inside of here. So we got a box inside of a box, and in this box, we have individually wrapped coils. The coilovers that you guys are seeing right here are for the fronts, and these are equipped with an 11 kilo spring. So each one of these springs require 11 kilograms of pressure to compress the spring 1 millimeter. These here, this pair on the side here, are for the rears, and these are equipped with an 8 kilo spring. Now all 4 of these are going to be on the car, and they're going to replace the stock struts that are found on the vehicle. So a standard spring like this is the standard one that comes on these Fortunatos. These are a good setup. There's not anything really wrong with them. However, it doesn't matter what kind of coilover that you buy. The coilover springs that usually come on these are a chrome moly steel. So they're good. They're relatively cheap, so they're not really going to cost you an arm and a leg. But they can get better from this. And that's why I upgraded to these Swift springs. So the company Swift, the only thing that they do is sell springs. They engineer them, they make them, they do all that stuff, and they design it so that that spring is made for whatever kind of setup you want. And it is the best kind of spring that you can buy. Now, the difference between these two, by just looking at them, there's a couple differences. Okay, this is blue, this is green. That's not going to affect performance. But the total length of the coil, so the material that you have here, is going to make a difference as to how it's going to ride. So the gap that you have in between each one of these springs, if you were to add all that up, you'd find out how much travel the shock has. So let's say that you have a spring like this, and you add up all this, let's say it's 5 inches. On a setup like this, even though it's the same total length from here to here, you're going to have a longer stroke, which means you're going to have more travel, which means the car is going to behave better, it's going to ride smoother, and you're not going to bottom out as often with this kind of setup. So if you guys are going with a new set of coilovers, this is a great option to do. You can also later on modify these coilovers to have these springs later. So let's say this came on there, you can take off the cup, the perches, and everything else to swap springs. But if you're at this point and you're buying new ones, I would definitely suggest upgrading to the Swifts. These things are a lot stronger, they're a lot better, and I'll also have more information in the description box should you guys want to read up a little bit more about springs. So the shocks and springs that we have right here, the left side are the fronts, the right side is the rear. So if you take a look at the front style, you can see that it's pretty much the exact same design as stock. So the aftermarket stuff is a spring over the shock, and the same thing goes for the stock setup. Now, as for the rear, the OEM style was a spring and shock that are two separate components. The aftermarket piece, which is the true rear setup, is a setup where the spring is attached to the shock itself. Now, when you guys are purchasing coilovers, you guys can choose to pick either the true coil setup or the OEM style. It doesn't really matter what kind you pick. They're pretty much going to work the exact same way. But the thing that I like is that when you get rid of this setup right here, you can actually replace the big bulky aluminum control arm in the back of the car with a smaller adjustable one, because you no longer need that spot where the spring will sit under. So that's why I'm switching over to this setup, but you guys can choose for yourself. So the springs up front are an 11K, the rears are an 8. Now I'm going to show you how to install these on your car. We're going to begin by doing the fronts. To begin, we need to remove the strut brace that connects up this side to the back part of the engine bay. There's going to be a brace that is basically a triangle that connects all three of these sides. There's going to be 3 bolts on the sides and 2 bolts in the rear that we need to remove so that we can get access to the 3 bolts that are securing the top part of the strut up to the vehicle. With that part removed, we can begin to work inside each one of the wheel wells to take out the stock struts. Once you have the vehicle jacked up in the air with the wheel removed, it's actually going to be quite simple how we're going to go ahead and remove the stock shock and strut assembly. So to start off, what we're first going to do is we need to remove the 3 12mm nuts that are attached to the top side of the strut. If you're using hand tools, you can get this done, but if you also have power tools, it makes this job a little bit easier and faster. After you have all 3 of those removed, you can jump down to inside the wheel well where we're going to be performing the other work. So following that, we're going to be removing 3 14mm bolts that are securing a bracket up to the bottom side of the lower control arm. The reason why we're removing that bracket along with those bolts is because it's going to give us a lot easier access to the lower part of the shock so that we can slide it and remove it completely. After you have all of that removed, there's going to be an additional 19mm nut that connects the bolt that goes through the end link, through the strut, and onto the other side. That 19mm nut needs to be removed so we can disassemble all of that. Now after that, we're also going to have a couple other things like the brake line that's held in place by a 12mm nut, along with the wheel speed sensor that's attached to the strut. Once you have all of that out, it should give you enough room to pull the entire strut out from the front of the vehicle. If you're doing this to a vehicle that has sway bars up front or even an aftermarket set of sway bars, what you're going to notice is that it might be difficult trying to fight the control arm to lift it up or push it down. I like removing the sway bar or disconnect it up front first on both sides, install both struts back in, and then reinstall the sway bar, because at that point you're not going to be fighting that sway bar to get it so that the one control arm is higher and the other one, is trying to fight to get up, or the other way around. So that's what I like doing for this. Now the install is going to be just the exact reverse order. But keep in mind, if you're going to be installing a smaller strut that's going to be lowering the vehicle, you're going to be fighting that sway bar to get it back up. So once you're doing the reassembly stage, you might have to use your jack to raise up the lower control arm on the other side to get it to work. You can get this exact same job done with simple hand tools. You don't need anything fancy, and you're going to be able to get these coils installed on your car in no time. At this point, you're going to be able to wiggle the strut out of the way. Be sure not to snag anything like the brake line or the wheel speed sensor, and then you can take the strut off of the car. Now, when you're putting everything back together, it is going to be a pretty straightforward procedure. So everything that you took off, you need to put back on. Now, we're not exactly trying to fine-tune the suspension yet. We first want to have all the coils installed on the car before we adjust any kind of preload, ride height, or anything else at that matter. But what you really want to try and focus on doing now is getting this strut to be the same size as the opposite side strut. So if the total length, let's say, is 30 inches, you want to get the other side to be the exact same thing. If we have to change anything, we're going to do that later. But as for now, that's how we're going to set it up. Once you purchase coilovers, they're going to come with coilover spanner wrenches. So you're going to be able to use those to tighten up each of the collars so that nothing is going to move on you or get bigger or smaller when you're driving. So if you hit a bump, the whole thing isn't going to compress or expand because stuff isn't tight. So once you're done that, you can throw the wheel back on in the front, and then we can get working on the back side. To get the coilovers in the back installed, the install is actually going to be a lot easier than the fronts. So what we're first going to do is remove the bolt that's holding the shock absorber up to the car, and to the bottom part of the spindle. You're going to be able to remove the shock from the car. At that point, be sure to have a jack underneath the lower control arm. So what we're going to be doing next is we're going to be removing the spring. And if that spring is under tension and we don't have the lower control arm supported, that lower control arm is going to fly down and that spring could come flinging out. So just be ready for it. Have a jack underneath with the weight of it supported so that once you take the bolt on the back side of the spindle out, you can push the lower control arm down, back off the jack, and take the spring out. Now, if you guys are at this stage and you guys are installing true coilovers in the rear so that the shock and the spring is all in one unit, what you're going to notice is that you can actually replace this big bulky control arm with another smaller adjustable one that weighs less. I am going to be going that route, but I don't have that part yet. It's ordered, it's coming in, but as for now, I'm going to be installing the new strut. That's the entire assembly, which is called a McPherson strut. I'm going to be installing all that on the car, tightening it all up, and notice that there's no longer going to be a spring found on the bottom part of that control arm. Make sure everything's tightened up, and then we can put the car down on the ground. So now with the coilovers installed on the car, we can go ahead and install all the other extra stuff. So we can throw the wheels back on, we can throw all the parts that were attached to the front of the vehicle, like the top strut brace, and all the other stuff. Now, I'm not entirely sure how this is going to sit. This is basically with the coilovers, how they came from the manufacturer. So I don't know if it's gonna be raised, I don't know if the dampening needs to be played around with or any of that other stuff, but I'm just gonna throw the wheels on and see how it is for today. If it's not good, tomorrow I'll jack the car back up in the air, make any ride height adjustments, and make it so that the suspension is dialed in. Now, if you guys can also do a 4-corner balance, that would be the best way to get a proper alignment out of a coilover setup. So what they do is they put the entire vehicle on a set of scales, they'd see if the car has any kind of extra weight on one corner, and they'd raise the coilover so that each one of the corners of the vehicle has the same amount of weight from left to right. So the rear wheels are gonna have the same amount of weight as the fronts. Now, ideally, if you can have it so that all 4 corners are the exact same, that'll be ideal. So you can have a proper 50-50 weight distribution, both front to back and left to right. But that is a little bit more expensive, and we're not exactly gonna get into that. However, that will be the best way to get an alignment for your vehicle. So I'm going to throw the wheels on the car, and then I'll show you guys how the Z sits with these new coils. So guys, the Z is on the ground and it looks killer. The fitment is actually pretty damn good for what it is. Now, I haven't adjusted anything yet, but I will be doing that tomorrow. Right now, the front end is sitting like a little bit higher on one side than the other. I'm gonna jack it up in the air and double check to make sure both measurements are the same. I'm going to measure the preload and I'm actually gonna measure the ride height, see if those are identical. If they're not, I'm going to fix it. The ride height in the rear though is bang on. I couldn't ask for better fitment. Now, I'm gonna dial this in and get it so that the car isn't actually gonna rub when I hit bumps or anything, and that's the main reason why I want to install these coilovers on the car. I'm pumped for tomorrow because I'm gonna drive the car and enjoy it to see how good these coilovers actually feel. So I've got the Swift upgrade along with these coils. If you guys want to pick some up or you guys want to find out more information about these coils, check the description box. I've got more information down there so that you guys can check that stuff out. If you guys want to pick up any of the products I used, again, check the description box. Anyways guys, thank you so much for watching. I'll catch you in tomorrow's video. Peace.